everyone to this special webinar, part of the series of webinars organized by the Coalition of Faith-Based Organizations, which is proud to sponsor this discussion of restorative justice, victim assistance, and the role of faith-based organizations. We're very, very happy to have a very distinguished group of panelists here. Myself as co-chair of the Coalition of Faith-Based Organizations with Dr. Michael Platzer, who's based in Vienna, and you will be hearing from at the end of the program to talk about upcoming programs. But in order to allow time for this program and the very, very distinguished group of panelists to share their insights and wisdom with us, without further ado, I want to turn things over to our moderator, Dr. Robert Peacock. He is a professor of criminology, head of the department at Free State University in South Africa, and he is president of the International Society of Victimology. Bios will be posted in the chat column, but I'm very happy to now give the floor to our moderator, Dr. Robert Peacock. Robert, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thomas Welsh. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our viewers. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you today. I would just like to give you just a short introduction to the seminar of today, which is done, as you've heard, in coalition of the faith-based organizations. We're looking at a series of spirituality and justice webinars entitled, for our purposes here today, Restorative Justice, Victim Assistance, and Faith-Based Organizations. Now, Emeritus Archbishop Desmond Tutu refers to restorative values as intense humanness, universal interconnectedness, compassion, respect, dignity, and harmony, as the very essence of being human. Now, this also means that our sense of humanity is inextricably linked and bound up in the sharing of a greater whole. But this is also diminished when others are treated less than we are tortured or oppressed. And then with victimization that seeks to dehumanize, it would be very useful to better understand the manner in which individuals and groups perceive themselves and their responsibilities in relation to others. Now, in recognizing the integral importance of our interactions and interconnectedness, a more holistic and humanist restorative way can be unfolded when dealing with conflict. Now, so this is particularly valuable within the context of faith-based organizations as potentially critical role players. Now, I'm going to introduce you to our speakers today. Each of them will have an opportunity of about 7 minutes to make an intervention. There will also, throughout this session, be an opportunity for comments and questions in the chat box. So please feel free to ask some questions. Kindly add also your name as well as your affiliation. So there's no limit to that. Now, first, I would like to introduce you to our very first speaker, Professor Daniela Bolivar. She is an assistant professor of social work at the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile. And she's going to speak to us about child sex abuse by the clergy of the Catholic Church and the possibilities for restorative justice. Thank you so much, Dr. Bolivar.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and for all attendees who are here with us today. So as Robert said, this is my topic today, and I would like for that to mention that we as a university recently released a document about the scope of the Catholic Church abuse in the context of the Catholic Church, and that is the source of the inspiration of my presentation. This is the document I'm talking about. It was written by an academic commission composed of 16 scholars from different fields from the university, Catholic University in Chile. And the mandate to write this document came from the rector of the university. And our commission works during 1 year focus on 3 different topics. So what we tried to do was to make some conclusions in terms of the nature and scope of the abuse in the context of the Catholic Church in Chile, to describe the response of the Catholic Church to these cases, and to identify what was the impact and effects on victims and communities. This was not a commission of investigation, it was not a truth commission, was mainly an academic work, which means that what we did was to put together different databases, different documents that were available publicly, and we made some conclusions coming from that. So what I would like to do is to tell you some ideas something that we learned from this research, from this work. What we did, the result of this work was a database with several cases identified, and that with cases that were committed between 1970 and 2019. So 194 offenders were identified in this process. And that's, well, more or less the report indicates that 3.6% of all prisons in Chile in this period had been involved in cases of abuse in the Catholic Church. From the side of the victim, we could see that 221 victims were identified in the context of this research. The average of victims per offender is 2.6, but there are at least 13% of priests who committed crimes against more than 5 victims. And victims tend to be male adolescents, as also is the case for other countries in the world in terms of the Catholic abuse in the Catholic Church. What I think is relevant to say is that most of the victims in the Chilean context notified their case to the church itself. 66% did that. Sometimes in replacement of the criminal justice system. And my interpretation of this is that the victims expect that the church reacts and does something regarding this topic. We also have learned from this work, from this commission, is that we could identify, of course, some individual indicators of responsibility. I mean, we could learn about from the cases we described, what kind of dynamics were involved. And as is usually the case in cases of child sexual abuse, priests were in general using their power, authority, and the trust that people put on them to manipulate the children, and using sometimes religious tools such as confession and information they got through it. But we could also see that there are important institutional responsibilities. For example, something that we could learn from this study was that in 33% of the cases, the first offense was committed when the priest was between 31 and 40 years old, and in 36% when they were between 41 and 50 years old, which we interpreted as something that has something to do with their sacerdotal life. This means that they don't commit crimes, or priests in our case didn't commit the crimes when they were young and without experience, but they did it when they had already some responsibilities and therefore some power and authority and autonomy to act. For example, when they were in charge of parish churches. This goes together with an important, clear lack of control and supervision and accountability mechanisms from the side of the church, and also a clear attitude of concealment and secrecy from the side of members of the Catholic Church. And why I'm saying this last sentence is because also in the study of all these cases, we could identify several negative reactions, like not to initiate, for example, an investigation at all, or to initiate a delay, to transfer priests from one community to another one without any investigation and putting more people in risk, and so on and so on. There's a really long list of things that happened with these accusations. So if I have to say whether there is any possibility for in the context of Chile to implement restorative justice as a response to these cases of abuses, as has happened in other countries, my answer is no, it's not possible yet. And the reason for that is because we need to fulfill some requirements that we are a bit far from doing it. The first thing that I believe is the base of everything is that the victims have to be at the center of any response, as a real and honest interest in listening to victims and in being responsive to them. You know that when there had been some experiences of restorative justice in this kind of cases, there had been some truth commissions or commission of investigation in place. This hasn't been the case in Chile, and that would be, I would suggest, the first step, that we establish a commission of investigation that is neutral, plural, and validated by the community, but mainly by victims. Secondly, that there is a global and unified institutional recognition of the abuses, not only of the abuses, but also of the attitude and response of the church. And I'm saying a unified institutional reaction because then we have to, the diocesan church, congregations and orders should come together to have only one narrative and position regarding this, which hasn't happened yet. And thirdly, I think it's important that we have, I think it's time to study reforms or to question how we are dealing with this kind of cases in the context of procedural canon law. And as we restorative justice advocates have promoted some reforms in terms of the criminal justice system in order to be responsive to victims, the same should happen regarding procedural canon law. And as far as I know, there hasn't been any initiative in this sense. Maybe I'm not aware if there's any, but I think it's important that we start considered secondary victimization seriously and to be more responsive in general way and a more structured way to victims of crime. That is for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Danielle. I've got a question for you. I'm just wondering about your views. If one deals with this endemic of abuse in a trust relationship, would you be in favor of a combination of a restorative approach together with a more criminal justice approach, or do you see rather the focus on restorative justice?
I think the answer, well, I am in favor of the combination, of course. I think both are relevant for victims. Usually, vindication is also a need for victims, that the situation is formally recognized as a crime, and victims perceive that the state reacts in terms of recognizing this as a crime. And in that sense, criminal justice system has an important role in it. But of course, everything depends on victims. I'm also being in contact or have heard of cases in which victims do not want to be involved in criminal justice procedures, and they do prefer something different in which the only thing they need is that the main authorities recognize what happened. So I think especially in case of institutional and historical cases, victims should be the ones deciding on how to deal with their cases. Also, criminal justice system, we know that in case of sexual abuse are not completely, I would say, responsive in the sense that after, especially with historical cases in which we don't have clear proof sometimes, and the only thing is the narrative of the victim, we know that criminal justice system is not always successful in terms of proving the offense. So sometimes also that produces a lot of frustration for victims. So I think that it will depend on the case and what the victims would like to do.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bolivar. Please keep on posting your questions and your comments in the chat box. We'll get to that. It's now my pleasure to introduce you to Professor Fernanda Rosenblatt. And then just before her as well, we're going to listen to Dr. Tariq Kul, and then Michael O'Connell is going to conclude the session. Now, I think if we stick to the sequence with Dr. Talikal, with her interest in legal and criminological and psychosocial knowledge involving restorative justice, especially in terms of children's rights. So we're looking forward to hear about your views, Tali. And again, just see the website as well for the more detailed series of our speakers. Thank you so much, Dr. Tali.
Great, thank you, Robert, and welcome everybody. It's great to be here. It's a great honor. And before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that this week is the holiday of Sukkot for the Jewish practicing community, or the Feast of Tabernacles, which I learned today. So happy Sukkot, everyone who is celebrating it. And I hope that you'll consider us as your ushpizin, which is the guests in the huts, in the tabernacle. Now I will begin. So my presentation is about the option of conducting restorative justice with children and youth. And I think it's a natural continuation of your excellent presentation, Daniela. I agree with you totally. And I will try to consider when it is possible to use restorative justice when the victims are children. I started this research several years back already, and I found that restorative justice offered a wonderful potential for child victims to heal from crime for several reasons. One is that a central value of restorative justice is respect, which is something that children often seek. Respect meaning treating them as individuals, as human beings, listening to them. Reparation is another value, central value of restorative justice. And by reparation, I mean monetary or material as well as symbolic. So acknowledgement of harm, vindication of what has happened, etc. Emotional discharge is another great value of restorative justice, which means that children have the opportunity, and all victims have the opportunity to really acknowledge their own shame and guilt and fear, and not only anger. And this is a great way for them to feel better after discharging their emotions. And of course, participation, which is the most, I think, revolutionary concept when speaking about children and children's rights. Children have the option of actually participating, being partners in a restorative justice process. But of course, this is not easy. And participation in restorative justice processes for child victims is challenging. And I want to mention a few of the challenges. First of all, there is always a fear that introducing them to a restorative justice process with their perpetrator, with their offender, might cause secondary victimization, especially when the offender doesn't take responsibility over what they've done. So this is a risk that should be carefully acknowledged. The second risk is adult manipulation, which is, of course, especially dangerous when the adult is someone with power vis-a-vis the child. For example, a spiritual leader, someone that the child looks up to. So this is something that also should be very much avoided. Pressure to participate or pressure not to participate are both risks that often happen and need to be acknowledged. And also, once the child enters the room, very often they meet a room full of adults, which means, they're not used to speaking with people who are all older, more experienced, more powerful socially and otherwise. So this is a great challenge for children, but that doesn't mean that it's not possible. It only means that, we should look for ways to conduct it. And of course, when there are cases of child abuse, for example, as in institutional abuse, as the report in Chile revealed, then there are additional concerns relating to power imbalance and institutional manipulation and etc. So these are all things that we should be very careful about. So when I did my research, I developed a needs rights model that combines a layer of international human rights of children and then the international human needs of children. And I'll go through it very quickly. I won't have time for everything, just wanted to show you the outline of it. So the rights layer is taken from the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which has 4 guiding principles principles of participation, equality, development, and best interest, and also includes 2 specific human rights of child victims: the right to rehabilitation after victimization has occurred, and also the right to protection against abuse. So these are all very central human rights of children. Then I added to it, because human rights are not everything, they're not the whole picture. So I added knowledge and literature and insights from the psychosocial empirical research. And I ordered these knowledge around four subjects. One is things that promote children's well-being, points that concern children as partners, the importance for children to be included, procedural justice for children, what does it mean, and developmental victimology. And I'll get into any one of these points at the question and answers session, because I don't have time now to get into it, of course, but just to show you again the outline. So once we have the needs and rights, I thought about the practical implementation of these needs and rights in terms of restorative justice. So these are 4 clusters of how to engage children in restorative justice sessions, or how to implement a child-inclusive restorative justice. And there are different insights here. Just to give you one example, in the best interest cluster, which is right here, I think you can see my signal, the process, the participation, the preparation phase, the outcomes are all shaped by the children's own best interest, developmental needs, and wishes. Okay, this is just one example, as I said. So this is the needs rights model for child victims and its implementation in restorative justice. Then after I finished this project, which showed in my Oxford University Press book that I showed you a photo in earlier, I went to child offenders. And it turns out that this very same methodology can be played for child offenders. And actually, the principles are very similar. So if we start with the human rights of child offenders, we see that the same general principles apply to them as well: participation, equality or non-discrimination, development, and best interest. And there are 2 specific rights for child offenders, which is the right to humane punishment, okay, and also what I call due process plus, which means due process plus alternative procedures, assistance, etc. These are the human rights of child offenders. Then we have the needs of child offenders, which are basically very similar. Again, we have knowledge about things that promote children's well-being. We have knowledge about children's participation interest. We have procedural justice perceptions of child offenders. And of course, we have developmental youth justice. How can any process relating to offense be developmentally appropriate? And then once we think about needs rights of child victims, of course, we can again find practical implementation principles for child-centered restorative justice when the child is the offender. So for example, a connection with adults should be ongoing, realistic expectations about their participation, and all kinds of temporal adjustments in how to involve them in the dispute. These are just examples again. I want to use the rest of my time to speak of 8 general heuristics that I based on my preliminary study about how to implement restorative justice to be child inclusive. So the first heuristic is the concept of holism, treating children as whole, which means that children are a lot of things, many things, and not just how they are in their school or at home or at risk or things like that. Children have different values and different ways of spending their time, different wishes, different strengths and weaknesses. And anyone who treats child victims needs to see everything, their whole picture, if you might want to say. The second heuristic is a tailor-made process. So the child-specific wishes and needs about the process, the whole process from the beginning to end should be tailor-made. right, according to their own, again, wishes and needs. It has to be very creative and very flexible. For example, some children don't want to be inside the room, but they do want to be outside in the waiting room and to be able to get in once they're ready, or get out if they get tired. The third heuristic is children as partner. Once we do this switch in our minds and consider children not as objects of protection, but they are our partners. They have unique knowledge about their own experiences and views and perspectives that no one else has. So we need them. Once we understand that, we consider them as partners, and this makes a very big difference. But of course, partnership doesn't mean equal partnership. And participation is a continuum. It starts with very minimal participation, which is, for example, asking the child, do you want to state your opinion? If the child says no, then they are asked for their opinion, and that's it. So participation is a continuum, and it grows according to their own wishes, abilities, readiness, timing, etc. Fifth is liberating children's voices. What I found out was that children have different languages, not only verbal, but other. Some children show their strengths through games, some through drawing, and adults' role is to liberate their voices, to let them speak up in their own language. Number 6 is let go. We as adults are very protective of our children. For example, it's hard for a mother, I know that I've been there, to let their children cross the street alone, but we do it anyway. It's very hard, even more difficult, I think. I'm not there yet, but to let our children or adolescent children to go to parties and stay out late, but we do it anyway when they're ready. We definitely let them ride, not like that, but we do let them drive a car when they're ready. The idea is scaffolding. What does scaffolding mean? It means that we give children their support around them as they develop their skills, their different skills across age, across their growing, their development. And once they're ready to achieve a certain ability, then we let this scaffolding out and let them do that by themselves or with our support around them. So that's the idea of let go, not leave them to their struggles, but support them as they participate their own way. Number 7, the restorative process itself is a goal. When a fair process occurs, children have a model of how to reach decisions in a fair way. They also have an opportunity to develop their empathy, listening skills, and also they can see that they can address their post-trauma symptoms while treating some very difficult contents. So the process itself can be very healing and in fact life-changing. And the last one is empowering advocacy. It's very challenging to advocate for someone and at the same time maintain their own empowerment. And this is what child advocates should do. So child advocates need to consider their clients as their partners, as I said again. Their relationship should be based on ongoing and trustful communication. And they have to elicit a sense of ability and power in their young clients. So these are my 8 cents, if you would say. And these same heuristics can apply to young offenders as well as young victims. And I'll stop by that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tali. Excellent discussion. I think a lot of appreciation for your holistic approach. Given your background in terms of sort of more the psychosocial context as well, I was just wondering if it's possible, maybe very briefly, just to demonstrate how can one apply restorative values during lifespan development, especially focusing on children and maybe issues around identity during the critical phase of adolescence.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question. I understood that you were asking me about an example, but I didn't hear the rest of it.
Yes, this interactionist context often between the different participants, the victims and offenders, during childhood and adolescence. I was just curious, you've got such a wonderful holistic approach. How can we actually individualize more towards this particular population group in terms of restorative values and issues of lifespan development, especially identity. I'm thinking about the values of, for instance, empathy, which you've mentioned. But how can we sort of implement this in a more practical way? An example.
Yes. Well, first of all, bringing children with their supporters that they choose, they select in advance. And the preparation is very important as well. So during the preparation phase, the children select who they want to be their supporters, and then they come with them. The facilitators have to be people who speak the language and speak the culture of the child. For example, in Israel, we have all kinds of groups. We have children from an Ethiopian region who are more shy generally and are less used to speaking with adults, for example. So this is a cultural difference. So a child whose parents are from Ethiopia grew up in a family where children and adults don't communicate in ways that maybe Western children, I don't know, I'm doing generalization here, but there are differences. So the facilitator has to be very sensitive to these differences. Another example, we have a large Arabic community in Israel, of course, and the Arab world uses the sulha. The sulha is an amazing traditional process of peacekeeping and peace building. And very often when offenses occur, there has already been a sulha taken care of in the community. So facilitators have to acknowledge that and actually ride in tandem with the sulha and to see how the restorative justice session can implement the sulha in ways that the sulha didn't. So there are different kinds of implementations, yes.
Excellent. And this is the value of restorative justice, is this sensitivity towards context and a special cultural context. Thank you so much. That was excellent. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
So again, we're going to get back to the questions. Please keep on posting your questions and your comments. I've seen a couple, so we're going to address those as well. Now, our next speaker, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Fernanda Fonseca-Rosenblatt. She's a professor at the International Institute for Restorative Practices in the US, as well as at the Catholic University of Pernambuco in Brazil. Fernanda is going to speak to us about restorative justice for victims, a voice of hope and concerns from the Global South. Thank you so much, Fernanda.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you for the Coalition of Faith-Based Organizations for organizing this webinar and the others. This has been a very interesting series of webinars. I'm very, very happy to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. The good thing about such an international webinar is that some people have had breakfast already and some are still going to have dinner. Welcome everyone here. And as Robert introduced, I would like to speak a little bit about, well, to pull together some of the observations that Dr. Tali and Dr. Daniela have brought on the benefits of restorative justice for victims, and play a little bit with this concept of victim, particularly from a Global South perspective. Well, although there's not much agreement on what restorative justice is, no one, I think, would disagree that it's something, whether it's a social movement or a new justice paradigm or a new justice mechanism or what have you, but it's something aimed at repairing the harms caused by crime, right? So RJ is almost naturally a victim-friendly option, which offers victims more opportunities for participation in the, the process of conflict resolution, reparation, healing, than the conventional criminal justice system does. And very importantly, as my colleagues have mentioned before, restorative justice also aims at preventing as well as reducing secondary victimization, which is kind of commonplace in our current way of doing criminal justice. This, I think, has by now become quite clear from everything that has been said before me, and also has been very well supported by other empirical studies. So indeed, empirical research in the restorative justice field have suggested that restorative justice programs can provide wider and more timely access to justice for victims, provide victims with a voice and an opportunity to be heard, provide victims with an opportunity for material and also symbolic reparation, mitigate the emotional impact of victimization, reduce post-traumatic stress disorder, and so on and so on. Unsurprisingly, several studies have reported very high rates of satisfaction with restorative justice processes among crime victims. This, of course, is all beautiful, good, and promising. Now, there's perhaps nothing more international than faith and faith-based organization. And therefore, a look into any topic within this important forum of discussion, that is within the Coalition webinar series, requests that we put truly international lenses on to discuss any topic. And that's not different for restorative justice and its benefits and challenges. This includes adding a global South perspective to what is normally looked at and discussed from a global North and or a Western European and or North American perspective. And that's very commonly the case within the restorative justice field. And this is what I'm going to try to do now for the second half of my small talk. I'd like to relook at the benefits of RJ for victims using a more Brazilian or indeed a more global South lens, as a means of teasing out the potentialities as well as the challenges of using restorative justice in countries such as my own, such as in Brazil, and other similar places. Well, to start, so in this vein, it is important to note that, like the criminal law more generally, and conventional criminal justice practices more generally, restorative justice narratives have tended to replicate the binary way of classifying people as either victims or offenders. I'd like to argue that this is very problematic, or at least not acknowledging that is very problematic, particularly in the global South, and for sure in countries like my own, like Brazil. Many decades ago, Niels Christie warned us that the creation of an ideal victim, the idea of the little old lady, he would say, the victim that's fragile, vulnerable, and so on. Well, where there is an ideal victim, there will always be an ideal offender, built within racist structures, institutional and individual bias. And unfortunately, there seems to be an ideal victim of RJ. It seems as we have, even if inadvertently, created an ideal victim of RJ. More often than not, this victim is disempowered, someone in search for participation, for recognition, for empathy, an emotional victim with needs revolving around emotions, moods, feelings. The victim in RJ is a concrete human being most of the times, being victimized by a specific, clearly identifiable offender, and not, for example, a social structure or an organization. Attentions are placed on the victim's psychological, individual disempowerment, while related social or even political disempowerment are more often than not left out of the script, of the restorative justice script. And as such, the victim in RJ appears to be sometimes, or very often, an ageless, a colorless, a genderless, a classless individual. But as Christie also reminds, the man in the bar is a much more common victim than the little old vulnerable lady, that is, the victim may not be this disempowered, emotional, and so on victim. The victim may not even be a person, but the environment. Victims may be collective victims of corruption, economic or more generally white-collar crimes. There may even be no individual victims, such in drug-related cases, drug-related offenses. Moreover, and I would argue that more importantly, victims and offenders are not distinct populations as such. These labels have the potential to dehumanize and lock people into one single identity. Social, personal, and cultural similarities do overlap, between victims and offenders. And this is quite often forgotten. When selecting an ideal victim for restorative justice programs, we are actually ignoring, for example, that in oppressed or marginalized communities, or in countries like ours, many victims, and I'm talking here from Latin America, many victims may also be offenders, and vice versa. Whilst the ideal victim of Rajay appears as colorless, ageless, classless individual, as I said before, we know the color, the class, and the age of those who, for example, are incarcerated in countries like my own, like in Brazil. We know the color, the class, and the age of those selected by the criminal justice system to be either victims or offenders. We know that it is people of color who overwhelmingly bear the burden of the horrific inequities of the criminal justice system, not only here, but all over the world. And in the global South, this discussion about going beyond such sterile labels, such as victim and offender, is crucial, I would say, and urgent. And this is my call today. A more nuanced awareness of structural and institutional racism within RJ practices, for example, are more than due. And although restorative justice is indeed is not a panacea against all social evils, it also may not close its eyes to social injustices. As the American racial justice and RJ activist Fania Davis suggests, it should be all at once a reactive response to harm, but also proactive relational strategy to create a culture of connectivity where all members of a community, regardless of the color of the skin, regardless of the class, gender, and so on, can thrive and feel valued. And this has so much to do with the important work carried out by faith-based organizations all over the world. The message, or the bottom line message that I want to convey here is that in our countries, well, all over the world, but particularly bringing a scream from the global South, often forgotten in such discussions, restorative justice practices may be an opportunity to bring problematic social conditions to the surface that may have given rise to a particular interpersonal conflict. We need that. We don't need ideal victims or offenders. We need transformation. We need a completely different rationale for our criminal justice system. And I hope restorative justice doesn't become like other very good ideas as a missed opportunity to make transformation happen. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Fernanda, for that excellent exposition. Also from a different view from the global South. I think it's really good the way you've alluded to that restorative justice can indeed be more proactive, and that it actually, if it focuses on cultural values and institutional reform, that there is certainly a good case to be made that it is indeed dealing with the root causes as well. My question to you is just, I'm curious, if we look at the Western-like institutions, criminal justice institutions that were imported from the North, would you concur that a restorative approach would actually be more legitimate, be more supported within the global South?
So what I think is, Robert, you know, whereas in other fields of policy transfer and criminal justice policies in general, the import-export rationales for restorative justice are more confusing, because we actually have imported a lot from the global North, but we have sometimes forgotten that these practices actually are very much based on indigenous, and so it's kind of a two-way import-export movement in which I do think we have a lot to learn from, where it has been applied within the institutional, structure of a criminal justice system, of a modern or postmodern criminal justice system. But on the other hand, I think that the roots of this movement that we have often forgotten about has a lot to teach to what's going on in a more institutional level. So I think we talk a lot about dialogue, and I think we sometimes get lost in a lack of dialogue between global north and south, and indigenous and more native wisdom that has so much inspired the movement, and the institutionalized way of doing restorative justice and so on. So I think my call is for a true dialogue. We have a lot to teach from down here, and we have a lot to learn from up there. And I think these movements should be more circular and less, vertical, so to speak.
Yes, nice. Thank you. So maybe integrating around our own centers, but within a comparative fashion, and benefit, of course, from past practices and experiences. Thank you so much for that, Fernanda. Excellent. We are moving now to our last panelist before we kind of continue in a group discussion. It is my honor and my pleasure to introduce you to Mr. Michael O'Connor. He is the Secretary General of the World Society of Victimology, and he's also Vice President of the NGO Alliance on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice of the UN in Vienna, associated with the UN. More to be seen on the sidebar in terms of his expertise. Michael is going to speak to us about restorative justice, victim assistance, and faith-based organizations now and beyond. Thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you very much. Nina Mani. I am speaking from the Adelaide Plains, and Nina Mani is the greeting of the First Nation Kaurna people, who are the original custodians of this land. As is our tradition, I pay my respects to them and also to yourselves for listening, no matter what hour of the day or night it happens to be. If you just bear with me one moment, I'm going to share a screen. Wonderful, I hope you can hear me. So I'm going to look at the concept of restorative justice. I'm not going to delve into the definitions, but because there has been much said about what restorative justice is or might be. It has been much said about the complexities and challenges in trying to actually define whether restorative justice is a philosophy or a practice or some other entity. I'll say a little bit about victim assistance, and my focus, however, is going to be on faith-based organisations in the context of those two items now and beyond. So as we have heard in various ways, and I duly acknowledge that faith-based institutions share the values, and by this sharing, I mean this is across all of the major faiths of the world, that they share values of intense humanness, universal interconnectedness, compassion, respect, and reconciliation. These are common throughout, whether it be Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, or Jewish, whatever. These are common values. These shared values, as we have heard this morning, when the speakers before me have talked about the various principles of restorative justice, to a certain extent overlap. But one of the problems that faith-based institutions, and none of the major religions of the world are immune from this. One of the problems that they currently face is what has been described as an inversion of moral order. We've heard this morning, for example, that about 3.6% of priests in Chile were responsible for perpetrating crimes against the followers of that religion, particularly young men. And here, likewise, in Australia, we have heard similar stories, and those stories have not been confined in any way to any particular religion or faith. In my view, this unraveling of wrongdoings presents both a challenge in terms of the way that it has marred the standing of all major faiths, but it also presents an opportunity now to reconsider how we approach those wrongdoings and the role that faith-based institutions can play in trying to right those wrongs and move beyond them to a collective future that once again is dominated or is premised on those shared values that I mentioned. Now, in terms of restorative justice, as I said, I'm not going to redefine the concept, the notion, what it might be in practice, but it seems to me that faith-based organisations who want to move from the now and to beyond, who want to restore the position that they occupied in the minds and hearts of many people across the world we share, the faith-based organisations may, in fact, utilise restorative processes to resolve their own conflicts. One of the problems that has been inherent in pastoral care programs that have been developed in the past is they've often been premised on trying to protect the institution from the allegation. They're often associated with the notion that they might, in fact, be intended to do more good for the institution than actually to resolve the underlying conflict, to address the needs of the person who has turned, for example, to a pastoral care program to reconcile the wrongdoing that has been done to them. Faith-based organisations may sponsor or support their members' participation in restorative practices. In my view, this is not something that they should shy away from, that there is much to be said. As I said, it just even philosophically in terms of the overlap between the underlying values of both faiths and of restorative justice. They could also advocate for the implementation of restorative justice programs as responses to both criminal and non-criminal victimisation. And this isn't a plea to replace criminal justice responses to acts that are clearly criminal, but rather point out that restorative practices could augment the existing criminal justice approaches. They could be a way, for instance, of addressing the harm that has been done by actually recovering the truth. And it's often said that our criminal justice court systems are more about legal principle and legal fiction than they are about truth recovery. And faith-based organisations could also encourage communities to support restorative practices, processes and programs. The Christian pastor or preacher or whomever at the pulpit is often in a very powerful position to be able to influence people's attitudes towards initiatives which are intended to reconcile as in Islam, Muslim, the Prophet Hadith said, to promote or make a peace that is just, that is equitable. And so they're in a prime position as leaders to be able to do so. In terms of victim assistance, many victims, despite what has happened and despite the allegations that are made against most of the major faiths of the world, many victims do actually continue to seek comfort and spiritual guidance from religious leaders in the aftermath of crime. Faith-based organisations are, in fact, in a unique position to offer support to victims of crime, and religious leaders and others who staff faith-based organisations, for example, can mobilise resources within their realm, such as food banks, clothing stores, charity funds, organising transportation, providing places for people to meet and to provide support to victims of crime. Indeed, in my home state of South Australia, the Victims of Crime Service, when in its infancy, met monthly in a church hall, and it was a church pastor that provided the various needs whilst that organisation began to seek a more solid footing. Religious leaders and others in faith-based organisations can also make referrals to social supports like employment and housing, such as that might be needed by women attempting to escape domestic violence, or indeed other people who may, as a consequence of a criminal act, find themselves disenfranchised or otherwise harmed. They may help rebuild familial and community relationships, and rebuilding familial relationships, I hasten to add, doesn't necessarily mean adopting a reflective approach to domestic violence. There are quite clearly some relationships that should not be rebuilt, but they can in many ways play a role. And they can also advocate for reforms to militate injustice, and that's not just injustice that is done in terms of people accused of crime, but I think they have clearly a role in terms of militating the injustices that are done to those people who become victims of crime. So it seems to me, if we look beyond all that has been said this morning and the small offering I've made so far, that there is a great potential for faith-based organisations to contribute to improving outcomes for victims of crime. Faith-based organisations can be instrumental in developing and delivering restorative justice practices and victim assistance programs to, as an example, right their own wrongdoings in non-litigious ways. But I hasten to add on this point of going beyond that. It is important that faith-based organisations are prepared to name the harms that have been done. They are prepared to provide adequate opportunity for there to be genuine attempts to repair the harm that has been done. They must not only give voice, but also provide voice recognition. They must also provide an opportunity for there to be genuine acknowledgement and equitable and equal participation by victims of crime in particular. And I'd also say that beyond, in many nation states where victims' rights have not been entrenched in domestic law and also in those developing states, faith-based organisations could be at the forefront of both the development and the delivery of victim assistance. And this is not in any way urging or encouraging many of the adverse practices of missionaries of the past during eras of colonisation, but in fact a plea to say that it is true that in many parts of our world and many developing nations, it is actually institutions, organisations that are premised and sponsored by people of faith that are at the forefront, and there would be a plea to ensure that those organisations, when they are both developing and delivering that victim assistance, do so mindful of the rights that victims of crime have, and through their example, hopefully may bring governments with them. So now and beyond, in my view, faith-based organisations must not simply open their doors to more victims of crime, but rather there must be a commensurate realisation of the legitimate interests of victims and the moral responsibility to help and protect those who are affected by crime. Victims must be more than recipients. Rather, faith-based organisations should hold the needs of victims as paramount. Faith-based organisations have much at stake and much to contribute, but now and beyond. And in terms of the coalition of faith-based organisations, we can actually help guide those organisations that are prepared to move from the now to the beyond, that are prepared to learn from some of the lessons that we have heard this morning from the speakers before me, and from some of the literature and experts. There is clearly a role for the coalition to work with faith-based organisations to ensure that adequate training and education as a starting point is provided, that there is truly a collaboration to ensure that no more harm is done. Thank you and good morning to all.
Thank you so much, Michael, for this excellent overview. Your part of the world, Australia, of course, also presents with a wealth of information in terms of Indigenous values. We've seen a lot of that. Yes, my question to you is, Michael, if we look at the very cultural ways of Indigenous groups, and I think the same would apply to Brazil and elsewhere in the global South. What kind of obstacles can faith-based organizations expect in terms of these stark cultural and also ideological differences between your Indigenous communities and, say, restorative justice?
Okay. There is certainly some very contentious issues in your question. There's no doubt, for example, that colonisation has had quite traumatic effects, and there has been intergenerational exchange of the harms that have been done, and in many ways, it was early practices of faith-based organisations. As I mentioned in my presentation, I'm not an advocate for a return for the approaches of missionaries that were associated with colonisation, but we need to accept that that is part of the shared history. We need to acknowledge the traumatic effects of that shared history, and we need to give voice to those people who were disenfranchised and an opportunity to attain recognition for the wrong and also the harm and also the consequences. And where it is appropriate, then some forms of reparations ought to be made. Now, reparations can take different forms. It can be a genuine apology. Quite clearly, many of the perpetrators of past crimes have themselves passed away or not in positions to accept responsibility. So it can be the institutions, the faith-based organisations themselves offering the opportunity for genuine apologies. It would be wrong to assume that this necessarily will bring with it forgiveness. But it does offer an opportunity for for progressive steps to be made. I hasten to add, however, and the World Society of Victimology has made this point quite clear in its draft convention on victims' rights, that no matter what practice or what form restorative practice might take, the rights of victims of crime must be paramount, and that there must be a safe environment provided, and that victims should have the right to choose whether they participate or not, and their participation or not participation should in no way be seen to be a mitigating factor in terms of either the responsibility of the perpetrator or of the harm that has been done. Can I finally end on that point of culture? Culture is of itself a construct, and it of itself can, in many ways, be manipulated to become a barrier. One of the things that we can learn from the history of restorative practices is that, as has been said this morning, whether it be in the Middle East, in Arabic tradition, or whether it be in Jewish tradition, or as I pointed out, in faiths such as the Christian or in the faith of Muslim, there are commonalities, and what we often do is focus on the differences and use those differences as barriers, and use those differences as from a position of power in an attempt to maintain our authority of doctrine over other people. What restorative justice offers is an opportunity to explore some of those issues through an open and frank conversation that takes place in a safe environment. And this can be done not necessarily by just one-to-one forms of restorative practice, but even in forms of circles and other ways of approaching it. But it's not a one-size-fits-all, and that's what is important. We need to be able to identify the times when it is right to adopt these approaches, and also the times when it is wrong to do so, because, as I said in my closing remarks, whatever approach we adopt, we should do no more harm. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. Excellent. Now, let's go a little bit to our viewers. Daniela, you've got a question from Professor Urban Waller concerning civil action, given the fact that we know that the Catholic Church has got some substantial resources. What is your view in terms of that type of institution?
Thank you for your question, to Irving Waller for his question. Well, in Chilean legislation, I have to say, first of all, that in Chile we have no state compensation, okay? And in our legislation, you can only get civil compensation when you are successful in your criminal case. So what is the case in Chile is that at the moment, most of the cases are still with an ongoing investigation. So we have, most of cases are still open. So we don't know yet what is the result of this criminal investigation. On the other hand, there is only one case that is well known in my country in terms of they could finally get economical compensation from the church, not only for the abuse, but also for everything that was around abuse. So it's still a situation that is not, I would say, available to all victims. First of all, because cases are still open, most of them. I have to say that accusations or notifications to the criminal justice system has happened mainly, most of cases, mainly in the last 2-3 years. And that was after the visit of the Pope Francis to Chile, when he sent after the visit a commission, two people, Chicluna commission to investigate some cases. So they collect a lot of stories of victims. So after that, an important number of cases appeared and cases were notified. But that is not still an option that is available for victims in my country, at least for the reasons I'm saying to you. And that is what I could say for now. I don't know if that satisfies the answer, but I know that in other countries has been the practice. In other countries, in fact, had been the practice after, especially after restorative justice practices take place, that some compensations are being discussed and agreed. It's the case of Belgium, for example, that after a commission of investigation took place, there were some mediation or arbitration, they called, between victims and representatives of the church, because, you know, in these cases, normally are historical cases and victims were younger when this happened, but they're adults now. And most of the time offenders are also or very old or already dead. So in these cases, mediation or arbitration in case of Belgium took place with representative of the church. And in these cases, compensation was also agreed. So I think it's something possible, but it's not still a possibility in the Chilean case. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniela. Here's a question from Keith Best to all of the panelists. As the Chief Executive of Survivors UK, which is a national charity, providing clinical care to adult males who have been sexually abused in childhood and onwards subsequently. Keith mentions that the major problem is persuading the victims to come forward. Is there any answers from the panelists? What can be done to encourage more disclosure?
I'm happy to respond if that's okay.
Yes, please.
Actually, I think there are two questions here. One is to encourage victims to disclose their victimization, and the other one is to encourage people to participate in restorative justice processes. I am not sure which direction the question goes, but anyway, the difficulty is to disclose a victimization. That's one of the toughest situations, and it makes sense because the criminal justice system is really tough, and victims of sexual assaults who report their victimization don't have an easy life. You know, the responses from the society, from communities around them, from the police, from the justice system, these are not easy responses, and it's like a combat. Many victims, and I have, for example, a recent PhD student who has just completed a set of interviews with young adolescent victims of sexual assaults who went through the criminal justice process. Most of them said it was hell, but I would do it again. I would disclose again because of the knowledge of, sorry, just a second. Because knowing that they did something meaningful, and because knowing that they might have prevented further victimization of other people. So that's one point. The other point is about restorative justice. And my advice, again, is not to try to persuade anyone to go to restorative justice. This is an option. Some people seek the opportunity to tell their story, to ask questions, to listen to the story of the other side or to the supporters, to hear the condemnation and the acknowledgement of harm by their own supporters. So these are things that's important for some victims, but others are not ready for it or don't want it or want to put everything behind them. So, you know, it doesn't fit anyone or everyone. Facilitators should just give the full information, provide a full picture of the potentials, of the risks, of what they may gain from a restorative justice session. And what we learn from other countries and also from Israel is that the more experienced the facilitators are, the higher rate of approval or consent or participation is by victims. So experience and being confident in your work as facilitators, as restorative justice facilitators, is very important in promoting victim participation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tali. We've got here another question from Professor Ibn touching on your presentation, Fernanda, as well as Michael's. Fernanda, your presentation clearly outlined that the criminal justice system, the Western criminal justice system, is flawed, and that we can actually increase some kind of trust and disclosure as well, using a restorative framework. Now, the question basically is, and I think this would go to all of the panelists, what can faith leaders do to increase awareness of this evidence Fernanda has found in her research, and encourage thereby a shift from the traditional retributive system towards a more restorative approach?
Right, thank you, Robert. Thank you for the question, Professor Waller. Well, public awareness, I think, is the answer. And the strategies for public awareness are varied as possible. What we're doing here now is one of the possible steps to create awareness. So events and meetings where we talk about this, but we need a wider effort. So, for example, we need the topic to really gain our universities' curriculums. We need, we're often talking about restorative justice. For example, here in Brazil, I'm from a legal background. I studied law and I teach law students. And we are often talking to legal professionals that have been trained in the old way and are hearing about restorative justice for the first time after they have been trained already, and after, you know, so raising awareness in the community as a whole means also invading the university with these topics, having events like this, having a space, and I think that's a special thing about restorative, the restorative justice field, is that we have a few spaces for publications that are not strictly academic, but that are are capable of using the same language as common sense to say, look, this is what we mean by RJ, these are the opportunities, so we need to, I think, again, like I said in the end of my talk, I think we need to get better at dialogue. We talk a lot about it. It's the basic of what we're doing here, of what restorative justice is about. And I think we need to get better at it. And so have more and more spaces for our publications to get there to the public in another language, in a more accessible way. And all these together, all these efforts together will bring more community awareness, and as a result, also the awareness of those working in faith-based organizations.
Thank you so much, Fernanda. A question from Margaret to all our panelists. What happens to victims if an offender decides not to respect the process?
If the perpetrator of the wrongdoing doesn't respect the process, is what I think the question you just put. Is that correct? Well, yes. So I put that question in a reverse. That is that we should not offer an opportunity for victims to participate in a restorative justice process unless there's a genuine commitment by the perpetrator, the person who's accused, the wrongdoer, whatever label you want to attach to that other party, unless there's a genuine commitment from that person to follow what are inherent in the practices. For example, in scripted restorative justice programs, there are steps that are taken to ensure that the environment is safe, that in some programs there has to be an initial admission of the guilt of the wrongdoing on the part of the accused person before the initiative for the program can even commence in whatever form it takes. The needs of an interest of a legitimate interest of victims of crime must always be, as I said, a paramount consideration, and there shouldn't be an expectation that victims will participate, but rather that they're given an opportunity to participate. And as both Talia and Fernanda have hinted in answers to previous questions, until restorative justice is mainstreamed and accepted more broadly across not just faith-based organisations, but communities at large, it will remain on the fringe with some sense of scepticism, some persistent and views that it's a soft option and so on, whereas the literature contradicts many of those myths and many of those misconceptions. And I see that that's where a role where an organisation such as the Coalition of Faith-Based Organisations and its members can play a key role in raising awareness, educating, drawing attention to the successes, but also not ignoring the failures. There is no absolute justice. There is no absolute means or process of restorative justice, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. Thank you.
Just to share with you, thank you so much for all the kind comments we're receiving in the comment box. A question from Michael Platzer. Do we consider the sacrament of reconciliation to be part of restorative justice? I think maybe I'll quickly answer that, given our time frame. Yes, this is indeed part of restorative justice, and it has actually been used very effectively within truth and reconciliation commissions, and I cannot help here now to refer you to, amongst others, the South African experience of reconciliation. Colleagues, so yes, we're getting to that part of the program where it is time for each of our panelists just to conclude with a few words, and then I will get back to you after that.
Yes.
Can we start? First?
Robert, could I just add, at my own expense, I'm of a Catholic background and a product of Christian Brother education, and I just say that in answer to Michael Platz's question, that I actually look at the sacrament of reconciliation, the process of confession, as being more a personal experience between me and an attempt, through admission of my wrongdoings, to reunite myself with God, and in so doing offer some reconciliation, some penance for breaching His rules. Restorative justice, however, has a broader application, because I think in some ways it's about not only reconciliation in that relatively narrow sense, but restorative justice has the potential for there to be reconciliation between the wrongdoer and the wronged, and more broadly in some contexts, the community at large. And so it goes beyond that personal. And I think it's important that we recognise that there are differences, because it's a very contentious issue about those two things. So I'll leave it there. We'll get in.
Thank you. Yes, just in summary then, reconciliation can take place on an individual level as well as on a broader macro level. Colleagues, Daniela, I'm going to start with you. If you guys want to say a few concluding words, and then followed by Tani and then Fernanda and then Michael.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just one single idea I would like to say at the end, and I would like to say this in connection with Fernanda's presentation and the idea of Global South. I think in terms of abuse in the context of the Catholic Church and restorative justice, there are really good practices that have been taking place in Ireland, Belgium, the Netherlands, and for sure there are others that I'm less aware of. But at least these three, I think, are very important, and we can learn a lot from them. But as I said before, all of them took place after commissions of investigation took place, and there were a societal reaction and condemnation of this kind of crimes. I think in the context of Latin America, we are in another step. The Catholic Church in Latin America still is having a really strong position in terms of power. And I think Chile and Argentina are the first two countries that have started with more cases that are known in terms of abuse in the Catholic Church. So we are still have to wait for other Latin American countries to start disclosing their cases. I think that is very much to do with how its historical relationship with the Catholic Church from the conquest on, from the Spanish Catholic kings and so on. So I think we still have a lot to see what is going to happen in these terms in the Latin American context. I think we have to also evaluate better how we could learn from other experiences, but also to find our own ways, other models to deal with these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. Tani, in conclusion?
Yes, can you hear me now? Great. So this is a great panel, and I think the enthusiasm that I feel from the chats, from the chat room, comes from the fact that faith-based organizations are very much like communities, and restorative justice is a relational, community-based mechanism to react to crime. So I think I can understand the interest and the passion that people are asking questions in here. So I think that the main point that I would like people who hear about restorative justice today for the first time, that I would like to leave with, is that faith-based organizations, like communities, are both responsible sometimes for victimization that occur, secondary responsibility, because they let the direct perpetrators to conduct their offense At the same time, those communities and these organizations and people who provide spiritual guidance are great supporters and a source of strength for victims and for offenders. So faith-based organizations can support victims and perpetrators in their way of restoring harm, of reparation, of reintegration. So there's a great potential here for faith-based organization to look at the restorative justice option and really provide strong communities for those who need it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Larry. Fernanda, last few words.
Yes, yeah, I would like to endorse everything that has been said before me, and just add in a couple of things on what Dr. Tyler just said. One of the biggest challenges within the criminal justice system is that as much as we do well, we can imagine let's imagine a restorative justice process beautifully implemented within the system, and the parties are satisfied, etc. The criminal justice process will end, and people need to go home. And the faith-based organization have a huge role to play after the criminal justice as well. So within, before, but also very importantly, we don't know how to follow up with after the criminal justice system. Like, the criminal justice system isn't big enough to follow up and to support after things are done and resolved, and that's where one of the central places where faith-based communities have a role to play in the restorative movement. And I would like to end just with a quote from Fania Davis. Fania Davis is the sister of Angela Davis, and she's a racial activist, a Blacks movement activist. She was for her whole life. She fought for peace during the Vietnam War, and now she's an RJ advocate. And in her book, she shares a dream about RJ that is very much connected to what I try to, to my dream of RJ. She says in her book, Race and Restorative Justice, and I quote her here, "My dream is that restorative justice as a worldview inspired by indigenous insights and as a medium of holistic change on interpersonal, intergroup, intergroup, and system levels might help us move from an ethic of separation, domination, and extreme individualism to one of collaboration, partnership, and interrelatedness." In this sense, I would say that this integral vision of restorative justice is potentially more subversive than the visions of any of the social movements in which Fania has been involved since the 1950s. So a word of hope, and thank you very much for the privilege to be here among these wonderful panelists, and to be here with you, Robert, again.
Thank you, Fernanda. Michael, you've got a few seconds, please, for the last word.
Thank you. Victims want to be heard. They want to recover their truth. They want to be believed. They want the person who listens and gives them voice recognition to do something. They want vindication and they want validation. If we offer processes that achieve these things, then we have an opportunity to promote healing. Many of the conversations that need to be had are difficult. They can involve the unraveling of great evils. They can also, through those difficult conversations, help restore the ideal of humanity. The conversations we've had today have indicated that there is some promise in restorative justice, but also many of the examples have illustrated quite vividly that the sorts of conflicts that victims deal with can also test the limits of restorative justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. So there's indeed a new horizon. I just want to thank our panelists for all of your contributions today. Most appreciated and sharing with us. And then our viewers as well, thank you so much. And then also again, of course, the Coalition of Faith-Based Organizations. I would like to hand over to the co-chair of the Coalition of Faith-Based Organizations, just to make some announcements. Thank you so much, Michael. That's it.
Okay, thank you all for participating. As many of you do know, this was my choice for the last event, Restorative Justice. I've been a member of the Victimologist Society for a long time, and I believe in the approach of restorative justice. I'm particularly pleased with, I think, our last speaker, Mrs. Fernanda, about relating it to structural racism and to bigger problems than two individuals trying to settle their issues. And so for the last webinar that we will be doing, we're actually doing two. One is about faith-based organizations and combating organized crime and corruption. As you know, there are some things which are bigger than one person. There are evil gangs. There are people who are killing other people. They're extorting them. And then there are the politicians who are simply taking the money. How does a faith-based organization deal with that? And for that purpose, we have invited Father Don Ciotti from Southern Italy, a priest who has been fighting the mafia for the last 30 years, has successfully gotten anti-mafia legislation passed in Italy, and is using the seized assets for social works. So that will be a major challenge. How do we, as people of faith, deal with those big issues where the structures are so big? And then finally, in the evening, we will have the Cardinal of Vienna, where it started our journey around the world in St. Stephen's Cathedral, as well as the head of UNODC, which is now accepting the role of faith-based organizations to speak, as well as the Minister of Justice, who was once upon a time an intern in UNODC, but is now the Minister of Justice of Austria, and of course believes as well in the restorative justice programs. So I'm hoping you will all turn on your televisions and tune in on October 15th at 3 o'clock to talk about the mafia or organized crime. And then in the evening, how can religious groups do anything about the corruption, the crimes we see at high levels? Again, I'm so thankful for you all listening. We've attracted 1,000 visitors. We've had 8, 9, 10 webinars, and we've had over 60 experts speaking. So we've created a small movement, even to my own surprise. But stay with us. Don't go away now because restorative justice has been spoken about. Stay with us. Help us formulate a program which will work with the UNODC and how we could work better together. So I thank you all for listening, and I wish you all for me, it's a good afternoon. All right. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And